Nice. Welcome everyone who's joining. We will start in 5 minutes. If you're watching this back on YouTube or Twitter, feel free to skip ahead. We will be chit-chatting with Carsten for 5 minutes, and then the hour of enlightenment will start. Or we can do awkward silence. That works as well. But then, if you agree, yeah, I like that. Okay. No, yeah, Supernova was very dense, let's say, with our working hours, but it was fun and funny. I don't know pre-Supernova, because when I joined DFINITY, then it was already in the middle of everything.
Yeah,
so
that's
I never
right.
really experienced what it was like what life is like before Supernova.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we've done for Supernova that we should keep doing. Like I would like to do office hours maybe once every week, not do it as many times as we do right now, and maybe do some workshops from time to time when we have something we feel is
always
to share. So I think some of the things we've done here for the hackathon, we should take the best of it and continue doing that, but maybe in a different scale, maybe a little bit less, but
maybe a bit more organized.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good things that comes out of this. And yeah, I can't wait to see the submissions.
Yeah, me neither. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also maybe we can do a live office hour once a month that you did with the guys. That sounded like it was a lot of fun. Even if it's only a few people join in the beginning, we can grow that to a bigger audience, and then we have these little mini conferences with coffee or lunch or something.
Yeah.
And then have an extra reason to fly out to San Francisco to meet you guys.
Yeah.
Then I have to. Then it's not about it's not up to me.
Yeah, it was fun to do the happy hour. I think next time we need to maybe find a venue that's where it's easier to find each other, because I came kind of early and grabbed a table and put some DFINITY logos on the table, but it was in the middle of a huge crowd, and happy hour is a huge thing at that place. So I think it was hard to spot from the outside, but yeah, we learned something every time. Yeah, it was. I hope no one went there and couldn't find us and thought that we didn't do it, but it's it's a learning experience for sure.
Did you guys have beers?
Yeah, we did.
Or okay, nice. Yeah, happy hour makes sense.
Yeah,
and that is also probably better, because then you have you're not time restricted, because if you do it in the morning, then people have to go to work afterwards.
Yeah.
So
we started at 4:30 in the afternoon, and went on to a little past 7, so people could drop by on their way home from work.
Nice. Yeah, maybe some of these evolve into Friday bars.
Yeah,
depending on the day you pick as well, of course.
Yeah. I'm just going to share my screen now.
Quick check. Yeah, good. While I do the intro, we want to share the screen and then stop sharing.
No, I'll just wait and share.
Yeah, just wait a minute.
Yeah.
And then we'll wait 1 minute for people to grab coffee, popcorn, or jump out of meetings and join us live. Then we shall begin very soon. A minute of silence before the workshop. All right, let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Supernova workshop. My name is Andrew, and I work at DFINITY as a developer relations engineer. Today is the second to last workshop for Supernova, and we are delighted to have Carsten Jacobsen back. He gave a workshop once on chunking in Supernova and even before. So Carsten has now become our regular guest or veteran for giving workshops. And today's topic is very exciting, and then we purposefully put it on one of the last ones because it is about open sourcing. And this is the perfect time to think about open sourcing your project and learn about all the different licenses, which Carsten will soon enlighten us about. So please, Carsten, take it away. If you so just one last thing. If you have any questions, we are monitoring Twitter, and then you can join us on Zoom and then ask your questions here. I'll read them out to Carsten, and he can answer all of them. So thanks again, Carsten, for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thank you. I will share my screen. So what I'm going to talk about it today is open sourcing your project. It's something that we, as the foundation, we have open sourced a lot of our code, and we keep open sourcing more and more. And we encourage everyone who is building on the IC to also open source their code. We recommend our grantees to do it, and I'll cover some of the reasons why we encourage developers to open source in this little talk. If you look at, let's see, what I will cover in this session is just talk a little bit about why open source, why is this a good idea? Then I will talk a little bit about different licenses. There are many licenses, and they cover different purposes. I've picked out 3 of the most common licenses and discuss what the benefits and what the obligations are. And then when you decide to open source, then some recommendations, what you should do and what you should provide with your code when you open source your project. So why open source? I have here a few reasons that I feel is at least to me important reasons why to open source your project. It's you can see open source or the licenses as a framework for how to interact with developers, and kind of set some ground rules for how can you use my software, and if you want to contribute, how can you do that? And what are the limitations? What are my obligations to the users or the developers who want to use my software? So it's kind of a standardized way to make an agreement with developers and saying, if you want to use my software, you are free to do that. But we have some ground rules we need to obey, and we need to play by. So it's really just formalizing in a very easy way how your software is used by others and how they can contribute and what you are obligated to do. So, oh, skip one here. There we go. One of the other benefits of open sourcing is that you give developers a look into how you're solving problems. Oh, just excuse me.
Yeah, no worries. You can take a quick second. In the meantime, I'll formulate a question to Carsten, because now he will list some of the reasons why you should be open sourcing your project. And actually, I want to ask him, what are the reasons why you wouldn't want to open source your project, if there are any. So once he comes back, and it looks like he has, then we can tackle. Let's start with the why, then we can do the why now.
Yeah, I think there are cases where you don't want to open source, and that's if you have some proprietary code that is maybe the secret sauce of your company, or it's something that has something to do with your products or your softwares or your services. Security could be something that deals with user information. maybe there are some parts of your software that you don't feel comfortable sharing with others, and there can be very good reasons for that. So I wouldn't say open source everything. I would say open source when it makes sense and where you feel you can benefit from it and the community can benefit from it. But if you have proprietary code, something that you have developed, research projects, or something that you intend to patent, then sharing the code is not always a good idea. But for most projects that doesn't have any proprietary code or doesn't have any secret sauce, it's maybe an implementation of some functionality that could be to benefit of others, or it could be a wrapper for an API, or it could be tooling. A lot of these use cases, you can benefit a lot from open sourcing.
Also, I feel like some of these large and complex projects, so the larger and more complex your project gets, the less open sourcing becomes an issue, because then people can't just take all of that and replicate it. It's not that simple of a copy paste. So once you've created the whole infrastructure of program, then it's even if you give that code to me, I can't really do anything with it. So it's more of the value often lies in the development team and how you execute as a team and as a project, than necessarily that small piece of code that you're really proud of, that you think if someone else could use it, then they could just replicate your success. Because often the case, I don't think that's the issue. Or am I in the wrong here?
No, I think you're right. I think in a lot of cases, it's more complex to run a successful business than just cloning an open source repo and replicate what the authors did. It does a lot with execution and growing your user base, or there's much more to it than just the code. So the code is kind of the vehicle for your business, but it's you have to put the gas into it or charge it. It's not the complete solution to just copy something and then you are going to have a successful business. That's not how it works. So it would be easy if it really was that way, but it's what you add on top of it that can make the big difference. So just to get back to the slide here with transparency, it's a good way to give developers a look into how your code works, how you treat the data, and just give that confidence, and you're not doing something wrong here. You actually you are treating your data the right way, and you maybe have some good ways of creating some kind of functionality that's interesting for others to learn from as well. So usually when you're transparent about what you do, that means that developers or users, they tend to trust you more. The more you open up, the more you tell, the more you show, the more trust you get. So open sourcing a project, giving that transparency, in a lot of cases, it builds trust both for the developers and for the end users who take the time to look at your code. Some of the people who are looking at your code may not even be interested in using it. They may not plan on integrating in their project, but they do it out of curiosity, or they want to see if you are playing fair with their data, or whatever it could be.
It's the same with DFINITY. We started to open source a lot of our code, but I don't think we are at risk of someone just copying the internal computer and redoing it.
No, I don't feel we are. We do have proprietary code, and there are things that make sense to patent, but the majority of most companies' code bases are really not. It's not, you can't really categorize it as an invention or a secret source. It's something that is, like I said before, a vehicle for your business, but it can't stand alone. It's not something that will make you successful if just you clone this repo. There's more to it than that. So one thing that a lot of bigger companies, when we're talking about bigger companies that open source the software, one of the things that they're really looking for is contributions. And I think this is totally a valid reason for even smaller projects, because you are usually limited on time or resources or developers. And open sourcing a project makes it easy for others to contribute. And contributions can really be a lot of different things. It can be like someone finds a bug in your code and they submit a pull request. It could be a security issue or a security hole. Someone say, okay, this is not the best way to do it. There's a security flaw here. Let me just commit a few lines of code that will fix this. It can be users of your open source project, someone, a company or a developer who has implemented your solution in their solution, and they say, we would really like to have this extra feature. If we had this extra feature, it would really make a difference. And then instead of going and ask the author of the code if they can create the feature, which they may not have the bandwidth for, or maybe the use case for, then you can go and submit a pull request with that feature and just go add it yourself, and make the software more valuable for you and for the community. There's actually a lot of companies that has so many contributions to their software that is almost like having an external engineering team. I worked for a big company that open sourced more or less all their code a couple of years ago, and they had like 2,000 developers who on a regular basis committed code to the code base. And just think about what the power of 2,000 people who fixes your bugs or closes security holes or adds new features that is to the benefit both of the company but also for the community. So it really goes both ways. When you open source, yeah, you make it your code available to others, but there's also an opportunity to get something back from the community in form of contributions or help working maybe on your documentation or what else it could be. So there's definitely an upside of giving your code away. You can easily get something back from the community if they like what you're doing. And something that I don't feel is talked about a lot in open source communities, but something I actually think is important, it is that when you open source and when you have a popular open source project, you actually have some influence on the ecosystem. And if we take DFINITY and the Internet Computer as a good example, some of the early adopters, some of the people who started building on the IC really early on, they have made some incredible code, and they have actually had quite a bit influence on adding new features to the IC, molding best practice for new developers who are joining. So you really, if you're active in the community and like you're building on the IC and you open source your code, you are showing the world how you feel that this should be implemented or something should be made, and have an impact on the community. And also, and it goes back to us as well. If we see the community is really, it's really interested in a certain features, and they kind of do workarounds to get to that feature, then it raises a flag with us and said, maybe this is something we need to do because there's a huge need for it. So the community has that influence in saying, this is something that's missing. Either they want to contribute to it or they want to raise the flag and say, this is something we should have. So through open source, you also have an influence on the ecosystem that you are part of and you're using. So I think that's actually that power. I think that's really, and the influence, I think it's important to address as well, because it is something that is impacting how software is being developed and in what direction it goes. So to me, it's an important part of open sourcing. And then I want to say to all of you that you're all pioneers when it comes to the Internet Computer. It's only a little bit over a year ago we did the public launch. So that means that everyone who's building is is really not, has not done this for 20 years or 5 years or 10 years. I feel everyone who's building, and also people are building for this hackathon for Supernova, they're pioneers in this space. They're pioneers in building on the internet computer, and I think that's great. When we look at how people learn, how developers learn how to code, especially in something like the internet computer, where at least in the beginning, maybe the documentation was not that extensive. We didn't have a lot of tutorials or workshops, or we didn't even have a lot of sample codes. There was some sample projects that was created by some of our engineers, but that was really not a lot for the first ones who really dived into developing on the IC. And we have much more today. And I think a lot of developers who are developing for the Supernova, they are probably looking at other projects that are open sourced, some of our sample code, anything where people share their projects, the developers can learn from that. And I think that's important to recognize. And I think if you really feel that you have gotten a lot of help moving forward, gotten a lot of help looking at how other people or developers, how they solve certain problems by looking at their code, a great way to give back is to do the same. When your project is you feel is mature enough, and open source it and let other and new developers learn from what you're doing. So just like the way that you learn from developers who were early on, they released that code as open source, they gave you the opportunity to use it or to just learn from it, pay it back, give back to the community by doing the same, and give other developers a chance to see how you are solving problems and how you are implementing certain features. So.
And I want to build on this just for a second, sorry for interrupting. Yeah. That sharing your code is one thing, which is incredibly helpful in open sourcing your project to give back to the developer community, because you are also seeing others' code and then you can take parts of it. But also another step that you can do is, besides sharing your code, is to create a little tutorial for people. Maybe you had a problem before that you found a solution that you think is really elegant, then you can create a small component or an example project in which you explain how you solve the problem and create a small Medium post for people to follow. And a perfect example is IC Gallery, or now I think Plethора's Plethора's Medium article, where they created a sample Unity-based IC dapp, where you can just set up Unity and start playing with it on the IC, which is very useful for anyone who wants to build games. And there are many different problems that are similar to this, that people will run into this again and again and again. And seeing a tutorial that just goes through this, and then it takes the reader, I don't know, 15 minutes to implement it and copy it, that's incredibly useful for the whole growth of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's not just the open source projects on GitHub. It's everything you can provide, create a blog post, create an article on Medium, whatever medium you feel secure or you feel comfortable with, share some of your experiences. We've had quite a few of the grantees, the developers who have received the grant. We asked them to publish some of their experiences, and both the good and the bad, because we all learn from both. So yeah, feel very free to publish anything that you experience and let others learn from that. And if there's code snippets too, you can easily post it on GitHub or create a gist or something, and put one of the very permissive licenses on it and say, you're free to use this, copy this, use it in your own application, do whatever you want. This is something I put out here for you to use and to learn from. So yeah, good points. Absolutely. We love to see articles that describe how to use certain features or how people are solving problems. That's always good to see. Okay, let's go to the next. I will talk a little bit about open source licenses. There are more licenses than I can think of. There's a ton of different licenses. So I will just I would say I'll use 3 licenses that are very common as examples, and just talk a little bit about what the benefits of those 3 licenses are. Before we do that, just very briefly, there are typically you typically talk about 2 different categories of open source licenses. There are the permissive. It's typically like Apache 2, it's MIT. It's licenses that basically let you do whatever you want with the code. There's really not many restrictions or many obligations related to it. And then we have a category called copyleft, which it allows developers to use the code, but there are more restrictions and obligations when you decide to do that. This is just a few of the many licenses, and I color coded it a little bit. The green means, yeah, you're free to do almost whatever you want with the code, and the red is more like, this is where you should be. This is where you should really be sure that you know what you're doing and you read the license descriptions and what it really means to open source with those licenses. And I will actually say this also goes for when you are using open source software. And I'll give a good example of that at the end of this. Because when you use open source in your project, then if you're using one of the more protected licenses, like a GPL license, even though you're just a consumer of it, you're not really modifying it, you're not making contributions, you're just using it because it's a library maybe that works really well with your use case. It covers what you really would like to do, but the license type can actually dictate what kind of license you need to use, and I'll cover that in the next. But I think this is important to think about open source license not just as not just as a publisher, as a developer who open source the code, but also when you use libraries or use open source software in your own software. And who doesn't do that today? I mean, there's more or less no software out there that doesn't use open source in some shape or form. Just think about when we spin up our front ends, there's like tens or hundreds of libraries that's being loaded at the same time, all open source projects, and they all come with a license. All of those we typically use are on the permissive side, but it's always good to just make sure that we're not using licenses that forces us to do something we're not ready to do. But for publishing and if you're a developer and you want to open source your code, this is just as valid. The green ones, it really gives a lot of freedom for the developers who want to use your code, and it takes away some of the liability and warranty issues that you could encounter if you didn't do it. So. And
what if I copy 4 lines of code from a restrictive open source project? Am I in danger?
Some of the license types actually don't allow you to just code, take a few lines of code. It's either some of the very protective, it's like you use the whole package or you use nothing. And if you decide to use the whole thing, then there are some obligations and some things that you need to do in your code, or if you distribute. Sometimes a difference between if you run it as a service or if you're shipping this code, like you make it a downloadable package. So the very protective licenses, it's a long read to go through when you go into the details of it, but it's definitely worth it because it can save you from a lot of trouble later on if you do your homework. Let's see. so for these 3 licenses that I'm going to talk about now is, and I'm using Apache 2.0, I'm using MIT and the GPL version 3 as examples. I think the GPL license is it's very unlikely that any of the projects here will use that. But I want to show it because I want to show the difference between the permissive and the protective licenses. So I think it serves as a good example. And common for all these 3 licenses is that you can use it for commercial use. You can use it for private use. If you're just a hobbyist who like to code and you just build things for the fun of it, for your own use, you can modify the code and you can distribute the code. And there are also the right to, if the code has been patented, then you are still free to use the code under the patent. Let's see. Oh. Some of the conditions that these, these are the conditions that these licenses have, is that if you choose the MIT, that's the most permissive. The only thing you need to do actually is that you have to provide a license and copyright notice. And usually this is done in the header. This is done in the header of the files that sometimes you see if you use an open source project that they have some copyright information in the header of the source files. If you use GitHub, there's also an option to mark which license you're using. So that will give you that double protection for this. And yeah, that's actually the only conditions that are for the MIT. You need to state what license you're using, and there must be a copyright notice, and that's it. And then everyone is free to use it. The Apache 2.0, yeah.
Before we go to the Apache, I have a question. So let's say if someone posts their code all of it on GitHub, but there is no license associated with it, and there's nothing on the top of the file either. Can I use that code? Should I ask the person? What is the what are the next steps?
It's so it's not defined exactly what to expect in these cases. Usually I would say if there's nothing, then there's a copyright on the code, but it doesn't protect you from a lot of the things that you can be exposed to as the author of the software. So I would say if there's no license or anything, you can assume that there's a copyright on it. But that's basically it. That's all there is. There's no clause or anything that says that if something goes wrong and you use the source, the code in production, then you as an author is protected if someone has something bad happen to the code when they run it in their own environment. So copyright doesn't protect against that. So that's a good reason why to even if you don't really have any intentions of getting contributions or really work with your project as an open source project, then just putting a license on to protect yourself is always a good idea. And the MIT is super simple. It's just the license and the copyright notice, and that's it. If we move to Apache 2, it's the same with the license and the copyright notice, but here we add a clause that if you make changes to the code, you must document it. So let's say I use an open source project in my code, and I make some modifications to the code, the open source project that I included in my project, and some of it is not working completely like I wanted it to work. So I just changed the code a little bit. Then I have to make a note about that. You can do it in the source code, or you can have it in your documentation or somewhere else. But you need to make a note of that. I actually changed this. This is not the original code. This is not as I downloaded it. I made some changes. So if you copy my project, this open source project that I embedded in mine is not the same as if you go pull it yourself from GitHub. So that's the only difference between these two. If you go to the very protective license GPL version 3, if you use a library or some code, a project in your own code that has a GPL 3 license on it, then you actually have to also open source your code with the same license. So if you work on a project where it's like I don't want to open source this. This is my closed source project. I have some proprietary information. I don't want to share this with the world. But if you do use a GPL license that is open source and where they like in this case the GPL version 3 say that you must also publish. You also have to publish your code if you're using this. Then there's no way around it. And I'll give an example of that a little bit later. So, and you must use the same license. So if you use a GPL license, the open source library in your project, then your project has to be GPL version 3 as well. So that's yeah.
I know it's a bad analogy, but it sounds like a little virus that infects the other project, and that will infect another project that uses it, so it goes on.
I don't know if I would. Yeah, you can say that. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is say, if I let you use my software, and I GPL version 3 open source mine, if you use mine, then because I let you use mine, you also have to let everyone else use yours. So that's like I give something, but you have to give something too. You're obligated to do the same. Yeah. So you can say there's some fairness built into this one.
I agree.
GPL licenses are usually not used unless it's something that really has some extensive code in it. There's something that's super complicated, something that went many engineering hours into building, and something where you really want to take a more protective approach to sharing it. But you still want to share it because you still feel the community could benefit from it, but you want it to be used in a similar level of software. And again, the license and the copyright notice always have to be there. And the same if you make changes to the code, then it must be documented. And then we go to the limitations. When you open source your project and you put an MIT license on it, that means that your liability is super limited. If someone use your open source code and let's say they use it in a production line, it's a library that does something and the production line just makes an error. So they make 10,000 products where there's an error because your code had some issues. Well, you're not liable for any of their cost of this issue because you have a license that has a very limited liability. I can't think of any case where someone used an MIT licensed open source project where they went back to the creator of the project and had them be liable for anything. I can't think of any examples. So yeah, it does say, according to the specification, it does say limited liability, but I would say in most cases it's the same as no liability. And there is no warranty provided at all, and that's very clear in the standard as well. The difference between MIT and Apache 2 is that with Apache 2, you do not grant the use of trademarks. So let's say you have your project is trademarked. It could be like you have developed an infrastructure tool or a library that can live its own life and you have branded it and you have created a trademark for it, then you are not by default allowed to use that trademark in your own software. It's like when a good example of from the hardware world is a lot of PCs have the small logo says Intel Inside on the outside. This is kind of the same where with Apache 2 you would not be allowed to have that sticker on your laptop that says Intel Inside, because that would not be allowed. So with Apache 2, if your open source project, if you have created a brand around it or you created a trademark around it, then the users of that, they still, the developers who want to use your software are still free to use it. They just can't advertise or use your name as leverage in their project. So that's what it means.
And as a fun fact, DFINITY's IC GitHub repo uses Apache 2 as their open source.
Yeah.
For license.
Yeah. It's the most common. It's by far the most common license. The most of this open source projects I've been involved in has been Apache 2 licenses. The GPL is actually, it doesn't have many limitations. The limitations is more in the conditions of using it. So it's pretty basic what the limitations is in the GPL version 3. It's again the limited liability and there's no warranty on it. It is more in the conditions with the GPL where you find your obligations and things you can and cannot do. So that's a little bit different. This one is a good example of why it can be tricky to use the more protective licenses. I don't know if some of you maybe remember a few years ago, Tesla went out and said to the world, we have open sourced a lot of our source code because we want to drive this transformation. We want any car maker to be able to use our knowledge to build electric vehicles. Well, there's a little story behind that, because what actually happened was that they used a GPL license in some of their autopilot. And because that, I think it was a kernel or something, and because of that, they were forced to publish their source code. So there was no way around it. They had used some software in their software that had a GPL license on it, which means that they are obligated to publish their source code as well. So then there was a nice marketing spin around it, but the reality of things were that they were actually forced to show the world how a big part of their autopilot was working and some of their software was working. That's not something. Yeah. I think it's a scary example of if you don't know what you are, like the software that you're using, because this was most likely an engineering effort. They found the right kernel, the right software that would really lift their own software that could do a lot of good things for theirs, maybe cut a lot of time. That they could use this library and the software, and they didn't have to code all this from the ground up themselves. But they were not aware of that when you use open source with certain license types, then there are some obligations too. There are actually software, and I know that from bigger companies, they typically have software that scans all the dependencies in the company's GitHub repo and scans it for license types. And if there is a GPL license, it raises a flag and says some engineer added a software library to our dependency list, and this one is actually it can force us to release code that we may not be interested in releasing.
The virus.
Yeah. So yeah, we can call it a virus, but it's the software that runs this, and I think most larger corporations, they actually have some kind of automatic check of if someone in engineering is using licenses that forces them to do things that they really don't want to. So yeah, I think it's a good example of why it matters not only to think about what license that you put on your software, but also the software that you import and use in your project. Also take a look at if they are permissive or if they are protective.
But this means these licenses are really powerful. If just this GPL license made a multi-billion-dollar company like Tesla force them to open source their project, that's incredible that they couldn't fight it somehow legally. They just had to open source it.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of interest in this from the community, because this was really a test to see how strong is an open source license really. And this was a test because there were a lot of lawyers on this, and there was no way around it. And you can say that's a huge win for open source licenses, because it means that the license you choose, it actually it will hold in court. I mean, if you violate the conditions, then you can get in trouble, and it's not something where you just can say, okay, I'll just delete it again, or I'll just work around it. There's actually legal aspects involved in the license type, and it will hold in court. So I think there was a strong message that software licenses in open source, it actually is very powerful, and it is taken very serious by everyone involved in it. This is a website I always go to if I want to see what the different licenses, what they require from you, and what permissions they give you, and what restrictions there are. It's a super good website. You can, if you go to it, at the top there's a search field, and if you type in MIT, or you type in GPL version 3, then it will show you in a very easy to understand way what are your rights, and what do you need to be aware of, what are the restrictions, and what are the limitations. So I think this is a really good website, and you can use it both when you pick your own the license that you want to put on your own software when you open source it, but you can also use it when you are including other open source projects in your software, to just make a check to see, okay, can I get in trouble if I use this? For the majority part of the libraries out there that are open source, is MIT or Apache 2, you'll not get in trouble. It's standard, everyone does it because it's super permissive. You can change it, you can use it, you can distribute it. But if there's a license type that you feel, this, I've never seen this before, this is a little bit different than what I usually see, this is a good place to go and look it up and see if there's anything that you should be concerned about. And then when you decide to open source, I think there's some things that you should think about, or something you should do, because you can say it is fairly easy to open source software. A lot of developers think it's complicated, it's hard, it's time consuming, but really what it is, for MIT, you just need to state that this code is protected by MIT, and put a copyright notice on it. That's it. But I think for your project to be successful, and if you really want to, have developers use your code, if you want developers to contribute to your code, help you develop new features or bug fixes, or give you feedback, then you should add a little bit more, something that makes it more interesting for other developers to use it. And I'll just mention a few things here. It sounds really, really simple, and it's something that sounds obvious, but a README file is really, really important when you have an open source project. A lot of times I say that the README file is like a landing page. It's like the first thing developers see when they find your repo. It's what they look at for the first time. It's almost like this is almost your marketing material for your project. And some of the things that I expect to find from an open source project that I want to use is like I want a description of what is this and what does it do? Like why is this important to me? Why should I consider using this in my project? And what are the most important features? Your open source project may have a ton of features, but highlight the most important. It's typically the reasons why a lot of people, developers, are using your software. Just list maybe 3 to 5 really key features. Doesn't have to be super extensive. If you have documentation in another place, then you'll cover it there. But just kind of give developers an introduction to what is it they can get out of this. And how do I install it? How do I use it? How do I test it? And how do I deploy it? Like these very key things that if someone wants to use your code, help them along as good as you can, and take some of the pain out of trying something new out. Maybe someone is just testing your project. Maybe they're evaluating it, and make it easy for them to evaluate it. Make it easy for them to make a call if they want to use your project or not. And that is including some of these things, like how do you install it, how do you embed it in your code, and if there are test cases, what test cases can you run, and if you want to use it in production, how do you go about that? So, and this doesn't have to be a huge long README file. A lot of times it can be done fairly simple, but these are the things that I would encourage everyone who open source a project to have at least this. At least help the developers who are interested in using your open source project to get a good start and make an educated decision if they want to use your code or not. So that's a good start. If your code or if your project is something that can run by itself, maybe it's a service and you just interface to it through an API or something like that, then maybe it's a good idea to have like a getting started guide or some tutorial that shows how do you work with this project. And this is typically when it gets a little bit bigger. If we're talking about maybe you made a library that can do let's say machine learning computations, then maybe you don't have a front end, you don't have an interface really, it's just a library you embed. Then maybe having a tutorial or guide doesn't make a lot of sense. But if it's more like in the type of a service or something that maybe even can run on its own, then show how to use it. Create a guide or a tutorial and help developers get up and running with your project. And so, the same goes for sample code. And this is maybe even more useful if let's say your open source project is something that is typically embedded, like if it's a library or if it's not like an encapsulated project, but it's something that's going to be included into another project, then show how to call different functions in the code. I have some sample code that shows, okay, so if I want to create a new user, or if I want to create a token or whatever it could be, then a few lines of code and says, okay, so this is how you import the library, and this is how you make the call to the functions. It doesn't have to be super extensive or advanced. Just something that just gets the developer started and get them a good experience and make them want to dive deeper into this. Oh, let's get one. Support. This is always up for debate when we talk about open source, because it's really painful to use an open source project and you experience some issues. Let's say maybe a bump in a version of a dependency makes it break, and you can't get hold of anyone. There's no way you can talk to the developers behind the open source project, or sometimes it forces you to either rewrite some of the code or maybe skip it and try to find another solution. So it's something that I would consider having at least make some ideas, have an idea about how are you going to support developers, so they can get help if they need it. and if they experience bugs, how do they report that to you? Do you have an email, or do you use GitHub issues, or how do you want to be notified if someone finds a bug or a security flaw in your code? And then how do developers contribute? A lot of open source projects, they don't have any information about how you can contribute. And if I see something I want to fix, or if I see a feature that could be useful, I would like to know how I can contribute, and how the author of the source code, the project, how they would like me to commit that. So help developers help you build your software. So yeah, this is three like very high level types of cases where some kind of interaction with the founder of the open source project, or the author of the open source project, where it could be relevant to think about how do the developers get in touch with you if there is a need for that. It's not meant as you need to have a hotline and support us ready to support the project, because you give it away for free. So there's also a limitation to how much you can support it. But for some key things like bugs that are being reported, or someone wants to contribute, or someone who's stuck, maybe there's a dependency issue or something, it's a good thing to at least monitor maybe the issues on GitHub. That's my recommendation. And I think that was the last one. Yes, it is. So this was a condensed, quick walkthrough of why it's a good idea to open source your project, some things to think about when you choose the license, and how you can help developers who want to use your open source project to use it. And yeah, I hope this was useful.
It really was. And even though it was dense, we still managed to fill up almost the hour. And I have one last question before I let you go. That is, let's say I start out with a project with MIT license, but I, for some reason, decide to change it half a year later, and I change it to a more restrictive one. Do you know how that affects to anyone who started using my project?
That's actually a good question.
I assume this is not something that often happens. I guess people don't really change and start restricting.
I think I know of one project where that was the case, where they felt that they had not picked the right license in the first place. And what they did, and I don't know if this is best practice or if this is what you should do, but they actually created a whole new version of the software. And they still, so they made like, okay, so the version 1.0 that used the first license, they actually kept maintaining that for some period of time, where the 2.0 version that was using the new license. So they kind of created a whole new project.
Oh wow.
But they kept maintaining the old one because there were developers who had used the first one and was not interested in changing the license. So they actually kept maintaining the first version as well for a while, and then they sunset it after a while and said, okay, we've given you a year to transition to the new version, and if you're not interested in that, then we are not going to support the project, but you can continue contributing if that's what you want to the first one. So that's one way you can do. I don't know if that's the best way, but at least it's possible to create a new project and start more or less from scratch, but still support the old one. And because if it's already been used by a lot of developers, then you can't just shut that version off. That would
that's true.
Practice.
Yeah, exactly. If you have a big enough team to support both, if you have enough resources.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's something that I know, especially bigger companies, that they try to keep an eye on what is the cost of open sourcing versus what is the value we get from the contributions.
Yep.
And as long as there's a good ratio between the two, where you feel that it's still worth it, then you're good. But if it starts to become too expensive to maintain a project and you're not getting any contributions, then either you should consider, are we doing enough to attract contributors, or is this just the nature of the code that this is just something we need to support and not expect a lot of return on.
Yeah. All right, Carsten, thank you very much for today's workshop, and thank you very much everyone who was watching. This was the second to last workshop, which means we have a last one on Monday. So please join us for the last time for Supernova, and then we'll figure something out so that we can do something very similar later on. And yeah, if you're in the last hurry of your development, then good luck for the long weekend. Have a lot of energy drinks and coffee. Load up on those, and yeah, submit your kick-ass projects. And we are really looking forward to seeing all of the great work that you've put in the last now 2 months. Yes, 2.5 months.
Yeah, I would say even if you don't feel your project is as polished as it could be, and it's not perfect, and the user interface is not as beautiful as you want it to, it's that we have more criteria than that. We'll also look at, is it a great idea? Is it something that's useful, benefit the community or users? A lot of different voting criteria. It's not just how beautiful the UI are and things like that. If you finish all your functions, so
Exactly.
whatever you have.
Exactly. And also, you might not win any prizes, but maybe we see your project and it looks interesting, so you could apply for a grant after Supernova. And because we've already seen your project, and if it's interesting for the long term, then we could help you continue development to make it something big. Okay, that's it from me, and thank you very much again, and see you on Monday. Have a nice Friday. Don't forget to relax for anyone just joining and not having a crazy weekend ahead. All right, cheers.
Bye.